Hi, my name is Melanie King, and I am an art history instructor at Seattle Central College. And today I'm going to talk to you about cultural appropriation or cultural appreciation. What we're going to do today is I'm going to walk you through a number of issues that deal with this issue that's been coming up a lot in the media with cultural appropriation, and see if we can kind of start to understand some of the issues that are coming up here. So our story begins really at the Museum of Fine Arts. It begins many other places, but I thought this would be a particularly interesting place for us to begin. This past summer in July of 2015, there was it was really in honor of, or kind of commemorating the departure of the previous director at the Museum of Fine Arts, that the museum decided that they were going to have people come and stand in front of Claude Monet's, this is Madame Monet in Japanese costume, and next to this and kind of in front of this piece, they were going to try on kimono. And people immediately started to protest this, and the conversation that kind of fell out from here is really complicated. So we're gonna talk a bit about this. But what we see happening here is this is a piece from Claude Monet. He was an impressionist. For those of you who may not be familiar with his work, we mostly know him for his water lilies. But what we see with this piece is that you have his wife who is wearing a kimono, and she is surrounded in Japanese fans are all over the floor, and they're all over the wall. And so it really is this post opening, quote unquote, opening of Japan, following Commodore Perry's arrival in Japan and from 1853 and then coming back again in 1854. And so you have this strong desire for all things Japanese in Europe and also in the United States. So kind of putting what happened in July of 2015 in this context, what you see is really kind of the legacy of colonialism, legacy of imperialism. And so a lot of the issues that we see with cultural appropriation are kind of going back to that history. And so people started to protest in front of this piece as people were trying on kimono and posing for pictures and saying this is basically just acting out this colonialism and really in some ways celebrating colonialism. There were, as this kind of continued over the summer of 2015 and July 2015, the museum responded, and you saw people from the community coming and were launching a counter protest and saying, no, we actually just think that you should be able to wear kimono anytime and it doesn't really matter. And saying that a lot of the younger people, because a lot of the people who were protesting were younger, and saying that kind of they're young, they don't really know what they're talking about, that it should be fine. And so it becomes this, not only this protest against what the museum is doing and trying to acknowledge this really complicated history of colonialism, but then also protests within groups who we would hope would be coming together, and yet it just ends up becoming filled with tension. The conversation is it cultural appropriation or is it cultural appreciation? And where is that line? So what I'm going to do is show you a number of examples and kind of speak to how is it that we teach about culture without feeling like we are othering another group that has often and has historically been marginalized, and how are we kind of honoring that culture. So I'm going to walk you through some work that I do with my own students, and in working with K-12 teachers, some of the conversations that we have, in the hopes that this can help you all think about how do we include cultures and not further cause really additional problems. So this is what I do with my students. I've done this with some of my students, mostly when I'm teaching either Asian art or Northwest Coast art. And so I start off and I have them brainstorm. I just say, what's your definition of culture? So have them think about, what does this all mean? How do you define culture? And so I'm giving you from Oxford Dictionaries our definition for culture, which is the arts and other manifestations of human intellectual achievement regarded collectively, and the customs, arts, social institutions, and achievements of a particular nation, people, or other social group. So then I have students discuss what their understanding is, and we look at this definition and see to what extent it lines up with their definition. And then we go on to appropriation. And so I asked them to say, what is your definition of appropriation? They have a little bit harder time coming up with that definition. But the definition we have, again, from Oxford Dictionaries, is the action of taking something for one's own use, typically without the owner's permission. So then I asked them to think about cultural appropriation, and a fair number of my students, and granted my students are working in a fairly urban college, many of them have heard about cultural appropriation but may not really have a full understanding of kind of the intricacies or the definition. So then we work and say, well, what happens when we put these two terms together? And so we give them cultural appropriation, and a term used to describe the taking over of creative or artistic forms, themes, or practices by one cultural group from another. It is in general used to describe Western appropriations of non-Western or non-white forms and carries connotations of exploitation and dominance. The concept has come into literary and visual art criticism by analogy with the acquisitions of artifacts, the Elgin bronzes or marbles, Lakota war shirts, etc., by Western museums. The term emerged during the last 20 years of the 20th century as part of the vocabulary of the post-colonial critique of Western expansionism. And so it's within this context and within this discussion that we can kind of view the situation of the MFA and what happened with people posing in front of Madame Monet in kimono as this is where it becomes problematic, as people are thinking about a post-colonial critique of Western expansionism and thinking about what does it mean as we try to decolonize or think about museums and think about other institutions outside of that history or in addition to, and think about it in a new way. So I'm going to show you a number of other examples, and this one is also situated in museums. And this goes back to Super Bowl 48. Between the Denver Broncos and the Seattle Seahawks. And what we saw is from the Denver Art Museum and the Seattle Art Museum is they decided to engage in a bet. And so the Denver Art Museum said they were going to offer up one of their Frederick Remington bronze a bucking bronco. And if the Denver Broncos lost, then the Seattle Art Museum could have, at the expense of the Denver Art Museum, this bucking bronco on display in Seattle for 3 months. And if the Seattle Seahawks lost, then they would send a New Hulk mask from one of the Northwest Coast tribes to Denver for 3 months. And once this bet was announced in advance of the Super Bowl, tribe members said that they were really distressed and upset and disturbed, really, that the Seattle Art Museum would take a sacred object and use it in this kind of manner. So the Seattle Art Museum, in some ways, they had the correct response, and they immediately said, we're sorry, we didn't mean to offend. And so they said that they would remove the New Hulk mask from the bet, and they would, in place of the mask, would then exchange with the Denver Art Museum a Tsujikako folding screen, and that had a similar motif. It had an eagle on it, also kind of symbolizing the mascot of the Seattle Seahawks. And again, while it doesn't have that same kind of sacred meaning as a mask, it's also kind of problematic because it just seems like the Seattle Art Museum was kind of taking anything that could be seen and really is exotic in a lot of ways, if it's either a sacred mask or a Japanese screen. And these are all things that through various part of colonialism that the Seattle Art Museum has been able to bring into their collection. And so I think what happens a lot, and having spent some time working in art museums and also thinking about art history, is that a lot of times the meaning of the piece and the depth of meanings and the layers of the provenance or the history that's attached to each object gets lost in these kinds of situations. So this is just one other example of where you see a lot of these issues kind of playing out within the collections of museums. So I'm going to just show you a couple of other examples from popular culture. And what we see here is this was a video that Gwen Stefani was in with her band No Doubt. This dates also from 2012, and this is called Looking Hot. And the entire video, the entire song is really just about whether or not she's looking hot. And the lyrics are really about if she's hot, and if it really is the essence of the song. And yet the way that they have decided to have the video show is her as dressed up as a Native woman, and it starts off with her being essentially imprisoned, bound, and then kind of plays out with her. Finally, at the end, it goes through this whole scene of her other bandmates are holding her captive, and at one point her arms are tied up above her wrists, are tied up above her head. And finally, it's her other bandmate who was also imprisoned, who actually is the only person of color in her band who, from behind bars, is somehow able to throw an axe that cuts the ties that bind her, and she's able to run away and escape. So this video, hopefully needless to say, is really problematic in the fact that none of the bandmates are Native, and that's kind of a side note. It's the fact that they're dressing up as a culture, and they are basically performing what they see as being Native. Also, there is a high incident of abuse towards women, and so to see this all kind of being trivialized in a lot of ways in this video is incredibly problematic. Part of the other issue that we see is that when people spoke out, the response that No Doubt had was they said, well, we consulted people. They consulted their Native friends, and they consulted somebody at the University of California system. They didn't say who. And instead of and they apologized and said that they didn't wish to offend anyone. And yet it becomes really difficult and disheartening when every time one of these issues comes up, it's somebody else who has been offended who has to put yourself forward and say, we feel like we have been marginalized, and this is problematic. And so it's good that they took the video down, and yet the fact that they were able to get so far through production to actually posting the video, that was when somebody finally said this is not good, that there was not somebody internal who was able to say this is a problem. So this is one example. Another example has to do with Katy Perry, who in 2013 at the American Music Awards performed Unconditionally, and similar to Looking Hot, this has absolutely nothing to do with Japan, as you can see from this Unconditionally. And what Katy Perry does is she basically she's dressed in kind of this quasi kimono, Chinese, Vietnamese, it's really not clear how dress. It's kind of a mishmash of all different styles. And her hair kind of looks like it's styled like a geisha. She has, if you can see behind her, she has the torii gate, which is demarcating that sacred space of a Shinto shrine. You can see the cherry blossoms are falling here. You've got the lanterns. At one point you have taiko drummers. You have, at other points you have these kind of elaborate calligraphic brushstrokes going across the screen. And you also have women who are dancing around in similar outfits, and at one point they're kind of like all twirling around with their parasols. And again, the song has absolutely nothing to do with Japan. And so it's the same kind of question that we have to raise with No Doubt, with Madame Monet, with the bet between the Denver Art Museum and the Seattle Art Museum here is, why is it that you are choosing to basically perform this culture when it really has nothing to do with the heart of the matter? And so there's other points of where the dancers all have these fans that say in calligraphy, when Chinese characters love, and you have the kind of rendition of Hokusai's Great Wave in the background. So it just becomes this kind of like sampling every kind of bit of exotic culture for unconditionally. When Katy Perry, after the performance, was kind of pressed why she did this after there was an outcry, she said, well, geisha love unconditionally, which just felt like it was a very dismissive and not really kind of answering the question. And I think one of my favorite comments was Lady Gaga actually came to her defense and said, people are being too sensitive. And that's also really problematic, is that when we raise the flag and say, we're really offended, this is really problematic, and then we're just told that we're being too sensitive, that is not really helping getting us into a new space of thinking about how is it that culture has been handled in these different institutions. So this is just one other example. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how this also comes up in fashion. So we have popular cultures. This is obviously another avenue, but going back to 2002, there was an incident with Abercrombie & Fitch where they pulled, you see the first headline, U.S. company pulls racist t-shirts, and what they did was they had a whole series about different, so Chinese laundry, and so one of them showed very stereotypical Chinese faces with slanted eyes. And along the bottom, it says 2 wrongs can make it white. So immediately the Asian American, Chinese American community cried out that this is offensive, and Abercrombie pulled the shirts, but said they were surprised that the communities were offended because they thought they were cheeky and irreverent, and that we would actually appreciate these t-shirts. So there was never really, there was an apology, but not really an apology. It's more just kind of, we're going to take them off in order to get people to stop talking about it. But there was never really a formal apology that really kind of satisfies people. Again, fast forwarding 10 years, and these are just a few examples. These are just a few samples of the many issues that we see. But here from 2012, here we go again, Victoria's Secret Angel, Karlie Kloss dons headdress, and this is when you see the annual Victoria's Secret fashion show of Karlie Kloss walking down as one of the calendar months for November, and is wearing a headdress, and so that was incredibly problematic. From that same year, you also have Victoria's Secret, the quote-unquote sexy little geisha outfit, sparks backlash, and this was part of their Go East collection. And so this is a Caucasian model from South Africa who is wearing this, it is very little sexy little geisha outfit, and she has chopsticks in her hair, and then also a little fan. She's shown as part of the catalog. And also from 2013, Chanel, this is a show in Texas for their pre-fall collection, and this is when they're showing controversial Native American headdress, so the same kind of thing where they had really kind of a stereotypical cowboys and Indian theme for this Chanel show in Texas. And from 2014, before we embrace Gwen Stefani's comeback, she owes us an apology, and this is speaking to the fact that in addition to the No Doubt Am I Looking Hot video, before that, going back 10 years, and in a lot of the collections that Gwen Stefani has, is that she basically is using the Harajuku girls, the Japanese girls from a very fashion-forward area of Tokyo, kind of as her entourage. She's basically using them as part of her performance, but they basically become part of her outfits. And so it's, again, she's really kind of trying on and taking fashion to really enhance her own look. And then from this past year with the annual Met Gala, the theme was China through the looking glass. And so there was a writer who wrote about the most questionable interpretations of the Met Gala's Chinese-themed kimonos are Japanese, not Chinese, okay? And so it's the same thing where you see people who are wearing culture, and yet part of the conversation that we see here, and I think it's kind of frustrating in some ways, is that there are people who are wearing kimono, which are Japanese, and a lot of the subsequent commentary is that, well, kimono actually originally came from China, so it's actually Chinese, and it's true. There's of course a lot of cross-cultural exchange and influence over the years, and yet it's kind of missing the point of what's problematic about people, and especially Westerners who are really, and this is white Westerners who are really wearing these different cultures in a way that's not necessarily honoring or appreciating the culture. So a lot of this comes up in the news, and I think especially during Halloween, which we'll talk about in just a minute. So other sites where we see this come up, I think starting with The Last Airbender in the middle, I know for a lot of my students this is something that was really frustrating for them, as they said from the original they were expecting to see Asian characters, and yet 3 of the 4 characters were white who were cast in these roles that would have been Asian or Native. And so when The Last Airbender came out, there was actually a call for protest for people to not see the film because it was so culturally insensitive. With The Lone Ranger, we see Johnny Depp, who is put in the role of Tonto, the Native character here. And so why is it that we're calling upon these old stereotypes and not only having white people play the roles, but why then are we also why are we still continuing to go back to these old stereotypical images? Memoirs of a Geisha came out, problematic for a number of reasons, but the reason why I'm showing it to you here is because we have Chinese actress who's playing the main role in Memoirs of a Geisha. And so even though you're having people who are Asian, it's really falling into the idea that, well, we all look alike, and so we can all play these roles. And it doesn't matter as long as you have somebody who looks appropriate. And then, of course, I just had to throw in Mickey Rooney as Mr. Yunioshi from Breakfast at Tiffany's, of how far we're still kind of in that space of having people play. I mean, this is essentially Yellowface, of having a white actor play the role of the Japanese neighbor in this case. And then just to kind of throw in as another point of where I've kind of to not only speak to how complicated this issue is, but also when we have Tom Cruise in The Last Samurai, Kevin Costner in Dances with Wolves, what you see here is that you basically have what's also the white savior, is that you have the white man in both of these instances who is the one to come in and to save if it's natives, or if it's the Japanese in the Last Samurai. It's really this can only be the white man who can come in and make everything okay. So that's another kind of side note of where we see cultural appropriation, or really it's basically diminishing these cultures and what they stand for. So just kind of, one is to really, I'm just kind of complicating how complicated this issue already is, but I think it's really important to kind of think about all these different facets as we're talking about culture and thinking about what is it that we're using to teach our students about different cultures. So one thing that I was mentioning earlier about costumes, this is, I think, a group that's really important to know about. And it's STARS, and so students teaching about racism in society from Ohio. And they were founded in 1988, and it started off as a class. And part of what I think is really interesting, and what you all may have heard about, is that there's a poster campaign that they started, which is "Wear a Culture, Not a Costume." And so part of the campaign that you'll see over the past few years is showing students who are posed next to somebody, a picture of somebody who is dressed up like their culture, to show that they're not whatever it is that that people are playing out on Halloween. And so their mission statement, which I think is helpful to think about, is the purpose of STARS is to facilitate discussion about diversity in all isms, sexism, classism, heterosexism, ethnocentrism, etc., with an emphasis on racial issues. We aim to raise awareness about social justice and promote racial harmony. Our job is to create a safe, non-threatening environment to allow participants to feel comfortable to express their feelings. Our guiding principle is based on the principle, each one, teach one. And I think what's really helpful, I know for my students and myself included, is to be able to have something to point to, and to send, if this conversation comes up, to have people be able to look at these things as opposed to always being the one to field the question and to say, why is it that it's offensive? Because that becomes a really, it it becomes tiresome, and it's a complicated thing to explain to somebody. So some of the things that I want for all of us to think about, and I think about this when I'm teaching things that are outside of my own culture and things that I may not be as familiar with, is these are questions that I'd like for all of us to consider when developing curriculum and introducing cultures to students, because certainly the message here is to not discuss culture. I think that's what ends up happening, is that once the issue is raised, people will either say you're being too sensitive, or will just say I can't talk about anything because I'm afraid I'm going to offend somebody. And I think that's not the message here. So part of what I would ask for people to think about is, what's the difference between cultural appropriation and cultural appreciation? So to really think about, am I appreciating, or am I just taking something because it looks cool, but I'm not really honoring the original culture? You'll hear a lot of that come up, I think, especially with the discussion around the Redskins, the football team in Washington, D.C. And so a lot of that conversation is, well, we're actually honoring the culture when it's not. So really thinking about what's the difference here. Also thinking about, to what extent can you engage students in this conversation, and so they can think about it, so that way you can have this kind of a conversation with students. And I would encourage you, as the way that I've done it, to think about having them define culture, having them define appropriation, and think about the history of what that means, and to also understand that it's really complicated, and each one of us is going to respond to each issue in a really different manner, and that's okay. And then also think about, what is the intention behind including a particular aspect of the culture into your curriculum? Really thinking about, is it because it's just cool and that students will like it, or is it something that is further kind of emphasizing, or without even intending to, underscoring this history of colonialism? So I think really kind of being able to think about the nuance of why and what different objects mean. And I think especially with visual culture, what do these histories mean that are embedded in each object? I think that's really important to think about. What's your intentionality? Again, it's coming back to the conversation that I have with students as they say, well, I don't know how to not offend anyone. And a lot of times I'll say to them, for me, when people ask difficult questions, I go back to the intention, and I can sense is somebody really just trying to understand something, or are they actually trying to offend me? And so I think if we can articulate what our attention is behind different things, that's really helpful. And then also, to what extent are you including voices, images, and perspectives of people from the respective cultures you are studying? So in any kind of history, and just off the top of my head, the thing that's coming to mind is when teaching about Japanese American incarceration, a lot of people will use snow falling on cedars, or stories that are written by non-Japanese Americans, which is fine, and it's not to say that there isn't value there, but to what extent are we using people who, like Julie Otsuka, who are actually writing from the perspective of having family who have experienced that, or thinking about using Native stories? Are they actually coming from Native storytellers? Or using Japanese history? Are they coming from people who are writing Japanese poetry, for using haiku? So just thinking about, to what extent are we using actual perspectives and voices and stories from people of those cultures? And then maybe one of the most difficult questions, but how do you respond when someone raises an issue about something you've introduced in class as being culturally insensitive? And I think I just wanted to include that question as a way to think about, we will always offend people, and we won't mean to. And so I think just kind of being prepared to say, I think these can be some really amazing learning opportunities, to have a really honest conversation and to really validate where someone's coming from. And if the response is, so we started off with Madame Monet, as people are saying, oh, well, those kids, they just don't understand, they're too sensitive, that really shuts down any opportunity for learning. And so I think as much as we can apologize, and even an apology is fine, but even to actually hear somebody and to try to understand where they're coming from, I think that can really make a lot of difference in kind of moving towards having fewer of these instances of cultural appropriation, having fewer instances of people having to say, this is really problematic, and then really feeling shut down when they're told they're too sensitive, or when they're told that they they're just young, so they don't understand, because that's certainly not the case. So I hope I've given you some things to think about. I certainly know this is a really complicated, sensitive, difficult issue to explore, but hopefully these are points, jumping off points that you can consider as you continue to work with cultures. Thank you for your time.